Hello to our listeners. Welcome to the Talking, Learning and Teaching podcast. On the show today, I'm joined by the wonderful Tesha Fitzgerald. Tesha has worked in education for nearly 20 years. She is an international speaker, author and consultant. Her life's work is to awaken, celebrate and activate brilliance by breaking barriers and stereotypes. Tesha is committed to excellence in education. She has worked as a teacher, curriculum specialist, administrator and director. As an international speaker, presenter and facilitator, Tesha exhibits an audacious perseverance that calls organizations to evolve into inclusive, anti-racist safe zones for all learners. With a passion for universal design for learning, culturally responsive teaching and anti-racism, Tesha has become a trailblazer for the anti-racist agenda in education, modeling expert learning while equipping others to do the same. She is the author of the brilliant book, Antiracism and Universal Design for Learning, Building Expressways to Success. And I am absolutely delighted to have her on the show. Tesha, how are you today?
I am doing well. Thank you so much, Kevin, for that introduction. And thank you so much for having me on the show today.
No problem. Thank you ever so much. And obviously it's quite apparent from the introduction that I provided on you there that we've got you on the show to talk about the anti-racist agenda in education and how universal design for learning can be a part of that. So my first question, it's a statement followed by a question, really. I mean, I'd like to think that most people involved in education, be it in the US or in the UK, would oppose racism. But what does it mean to be anti-racist in an educational context?
That's a really thoughtful question. And as we grapple with what it means to be anti-racist, I think there is a step back that we have to take. And that's first to acknowledge that racism exists. In this work, I find that there are people who reject the notion that racism exists. And so as an organization or an educational institution, I think the first step is to acknowledge that racism exists and it causes pain to our learners of color. And in causing pain to our learners of color or faculty of color, it actually causes pain to every member of the learning organization. Secondly, organizationally, in our acknowledgement that racism exists, we have to be clear about where racism is showing up in our outcomes, in our curricula, in our disciplinary practices, in our expectations, in our policies. So anti-racism is first acknowledging that racism exists, second, being clear as an organization about where racism is showing up, and then the anti-racism part is doing the work of eliminating, abolishing, tearing down racism wherever it is showing up in our systems, in our practices, in our beliefs, and in ourselves.
So it's about far more then than just opposing racism. It goes to a much deeper level than that. And I think that was a fascinating answer that you provided, because obviously it's become quite a well-known phrase, hasn't it, within education throughout the world, actually, this idea of, perhaps opposing racism isn't enough. We need to be anti-racist in our approaches. To what extent do you think people of color fail to achieve their potential because the learning environment fails to recognize their needs and experiences?
In thinking about systems and how they either serve or don't serve people of color, I think that Gloria Ladson-Billings says it best. She says that people of color are owed an educational debt because of systemic failures to create an environment that promotes equitable learning outcomes. So if we're only acknowledging learning if it can be attained through print and lecture, then we are literally closing the door on learning to very many students, including students of color, students with disabilities, students who are culturally different. And so if there are only two ways to take in learning, then we owe learners a universally designed learning environment. There is an educational debt that exists. If we only use one way for learners to take in the learning, then we fail them. If we only use one way for learners to show what they know, then we shun the millions of ways that brilliance can be birthed, bred, and built. That failure is on the system. And so when I think about the brilliant people of color whose brilliance was not accepted because the learning environment either didn't expect them to be brilliant or support their brilliances as they showed up, I think first about August Wilson. August Wilson is a Pulitzer Prize winning playwright. He wrote Fences and a number of different plays. My favorite one is The Piano Lesson, which is going to be on Broadway this year. So I've reached out to my broad realm of students that I had in English 11 and said, hey, it's on Broadway. I know how you all feel about this play. Like, go and see it. But August Wilson, when he was in high school, wrote a 20-page paper per his teacher's assignment. And then he was accused of plagiarism. This accusation of plagiarism really led to a long line of offenses that he suffered in school, and he dropped out. Imagine this: Pulitzer Prize winning author whose paper was too good to be true, accused of plagiarizing, and drops out of high school and is cleaning tables and washing, doing odd jobs around the city because his brilliance didn't come in the skin color package that his teachers expected. I think about Edmonia Lewis, who was the first sculptor of Black and Native heritage to receive international acclaim. Now, she did go to college in Oberlin, which is right in Ohio, where I am, a groundbreaking college that prides itself on inclusion, especially in the 1800s, for both Blacks and for women. However, she had two white roommates who accused her of poisoning their wine. And so she was acquitted. She was not guilty of doing this, but she was brutally beaten outside of the courtroom. And then when she was admitted back to school, they accused her of stealing art supplies. It makes me think about how many geniuses of color are penalized for their brilliance, or they are in systems that don't serve brilliance in the way it shows up for them. Their writing may be the way that they communicate brilliance, or maybe it's sculpting, maybe it's creating a blog or a film strip, maybe it's singing or poetry or dance. Is it welcome to show what they've known or what they've learned? And so when we think about students of color or learners of color, I think that this is why I hold to universal design for learning as a tool for anti-racism, because there is more than one way to take in learning. There are multiple ways to show what you know, and there are multiple ways to be supported in that acquisition of knowledge. And when we give learners multiple ways to take in, then we reach so many more than if we say there's one way to do everything, and that one way is not built for you.
I couldn't agree more with everything that you said, Tesha. I think that aspect there about the experiences of people of colour being a barrier to their potential was clear from all the examples that you provided there. I mean, in terms of recognising needs and experiences, as we spoke about, I mean, to what extent does knowing and understanding our learners play in creating an anti-racist classroom? I mean, do we currently do enough to learn about the cultural and racial heritage of our learners?
I think knowing our learners or getting to know our learners is extending to them the beauty of care in the form of curiosity. And so when I want to know about you or want to learn about you, what I'm saying is your existence has value here. The only way that I can design with you or for you is to know you. And if I use what I think about you or what I think I know to be the truth about you, then I am designing based on assumptions, and I'm designing based on implicit or explicit biases, and I become the threat. I become the barrier, and then the curriculum serves my purpose. The assessments serve my purpose, all threatening, all unsafe. Committing to learning about our learners culturally and racially must be paired with learning about who they are academically and cognitively. And far too many anti-racist efforts focus just on culture or just on race, and we neglect that each learner brings brilliance and genius into the classroom. We have to lay down the power of decision making. And in my book, Antiracism and Universal Design for Learning, I talk a lot about the dichotomy between power and honor. I have to lay down my power, my decision making for you, my biases about you, and pick up honor so that I learn you in order to serve you. And as we serve those who we are learning about, we place ourselves in that role of expert learner. We actually serve their humanity, which makes it anti-racist, anti-ableist, safe, welcoming learning environment that is necessary for some who have been assaulted culturally and academically over the years, but beneficial for all.
Your answer to that question leads quite nicely into the next question, because you mentioned sort of inherent biases there. I mean, to what extent should we as teachers reflect on the dominant racial and cultural norms in our classrooms, particularly if we are not people of colour? I mean, is there often an inherent bias that we fail to recognise or address because the cultural norms in our classroom tend to reflect our own?
I think the work of anti-racism is moving beyond our own reflections and looking at where racism is showing up, where the barriers are showing up, where the outcomes are different for learners of color than their white counterparts, and then honoring the humanity in the fullness. And so I can't just see you academically, I can't just see your test scores, but I have to see your fullness. And honoring humanity means seeing me, my race, my background, my culture, my struggles, and my differences, but don't just focus there. My brilliance, my innovative thinking, the ways that I'm divergent, the ways that I'm very different. This is the reason why August Wilson was dismissed, right? His brilliances were not welcome because of the color of his skin. And it's the reason that Black students in the United States are suspended at a rate of 3 times higher than their white counterparts. And so you can predict their experience simply based on their skin color. That's not an accident, and it will require learners, leaders, teachers who are white to recognize those barriers, recognize those biases, but not just recognize them, do the work to make the change to serve each learner. Anti-racism means that I am committed to both seeing you and serving you. There is no superiority. I don't get to decide who you are. I get to learn who you are and then serve you from what you teach me about you.
So turning our attention to UDL now specifically, how does UDL help us to create an anti-racist classroom? I mean, do we have to think differently about the UDL principles?
When I look at the Universal Design for Learning principles, I see them as a tool for liberation. I think the guidelines invite learners to be in a place of authority, not some learners, not a subsection of learners, but for every learner to be in that position of authority. I get excited when I think about classrooms that free students to drive themselves to the destination of their choice with support. Just like I think about the analogy that I use in my book and I talk about often is this driving analogy. We wouldn't dare just turn the keys over to anyone and say, hey, you should be able to drive, just go. We would not teach people how to drive only in a classroom and say, yep, you're safe, go ahead, take the test, hit the road. But there is an environment that places the learner in the driver's seat with the safety and the supports and the information and the actual practice, because eventually we see them as drivers. And so we give them every opportunity to practice where it's safe, to learn where they can ask questions. School has to be the same. We know that schools have been set up on white achievement, white norms, but Universal Design for Learning pushes us to design for those who are in front of us, design with those who are in front of us. So you get to make decisions as a learner that place you in a position of authority, of course, with support, with safe places to practice, with flexibility on how you approach. And so in my book, I talk about power versus honor. This is another example of how a power-driven classroom cannot be universally designed. If one person is making the decisions for everyone, how they'll take in information, how they'll give out information, how they'll be supported. In a power-driven classroom, only one person gets to decide what kinds of supports you get, when you get them, what should happen when you get them. In a universally designed learning environment, you get to make decisions for you. And so when we think about anti-racism as a theory, it cannot be anti-racism until it is an action. And universal design gives us many, many actions that we can support learners to take for themselves. It gives us actions for us to reflect on how much control are we holding back from learners, and then explore the reasons why. And after we explore the reasons why, we get to redesign, to make the change, to place each learner, Black, white, disabled, LGBTQIA, in the driver's seat to introduce us to content, to make decisions for themselves, to choose supports and then evaluate whether those supports work for them or not, to have a menu, or as Katie Novak says, a buffet of options to choose from. But then they get to make the decision on whether this belongs in my toolbox or this is for someone else. And that, for students of color, is a way for the power to be restored to them, to make decisions for themselves when environments have long made decisions about them, given decisions to them, and actually punish them for being brilliant in ways that were not welcome. Universal design invites brilliance in multiple ways into the classroom, supports it, and reinforces that decision making for every learner.
One of the things that resonated with me there that you said, Tesha, was this idea that we have to design with the learners in front of us in mind, rather than sort of preempting or second guessing what the learners might be. Because I mean, that's a core facet of effective teaching, however we want to discuss it, isn't it? I mean, if you have to design for whom is in the room at any given point in time. But unfortunately, what we tend to find, I mean, my area is higher education, we tend to sort of base design on sort of historical traits, things that we've always done. And one of the great things that I certainly think about UDL is that it really takes into account the variability among the learners and how we must really, really make sure that we are designing and delivering in a way that matches their needs and their preferences. What I wanted to move on to, I wanted to stick with the UDL guidelines. So I just wanted to get your views really, Tesha, on the current UDL guidelines and whether you feel that they need to include more on anti-racism.
So I'm part of a team that's working through the language on the UDL guidelines, but the current guidelines really need more pathways to understanding how to implement them in variable contexts. And so it's not just the language. It has never just been about the words on the page. And with anti-racism, it's impossible for anti-racism to just be words or theory or a checkpoint. It is action. And so it's more about how we apply these. Yes, I think we need to be more explicit about what can be a threat or what can be a barrier in a number of different contexts. And I think that comes with revising and modeling this expert learning that we are promoting so deeply. We model this to say the guidelines are imperfect. We acknowledge that. And so in taking a look at the guidelines to see how do they best serve a wide variety of stakeholders who are using them to improve teaching and learning in their context. And there's a number of different ways that we can do that. So as we walk through the guidelines, we've explored a number of different ways that we can support the work of practitioners. But it comes back to knowing that every threat and every barrier won't be listed in a place, but we can use universal design for learning to address any barrier or any threat that manifests itself in the learning environment.
I like what you said there, how every threat and barrier won't be listed in some place, because quite often I get asked by trainee teachers about, well, what kind of barriers should I plan for? And I'm like, well, learner variability, the sources of variability are too numerous to mention in any list, really. But if you're applying UDL in the correct way, you are actively trying to remove barriers from the environment. And that's the key point, isn't it? It's the environment that has the barriers, not the people.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a really, really key point that everybody that's interested in UDL should use as a sort of take-home message, really. I mean, sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to add one thing to that. As we are trying to find out what the threats and the barriers are, I think our most powerful tool is to ask our learners, what serves you well in this learning environment? What do you wish would go away forever? And it's not that they will get their wish list, but it'll teach you as the designer of the experience how to support them along the way, where to push, where there may be a trigger, maybe there's baggage from the past, and there are some things or threats or barriers that learners may not ever share with us, but we design for those anyhow. And so if there's anxiety about assessment, then we design to give them choices and options. If there are some things that we can anticipate, but we don't assume. We ask, and then we listen to the actions, to the words that they share, and to the outcomes that teach us how to improve our instruction.
So thinking about instruction and design, what are the first steps we should take in creating a universally designed anti-racist classroom?
I think one of the first steps that we can take, we know that in universally designed learning environments, there is an intention that's underlying that every learner feels safe. I think an anti-racist classroom is designed to purposely protect that safety for learners of color. And so we have to create these safe zones where we invite the voice of every learner to the table in multiple ways. And when we invite their voices to the table, we have to then take painstaking steps to treasure every voice we hear. We have to teach listening explicitly. We often talk about voice and choice. And then when we have learners to share their voice, we don't have a mechanism to receive it. And so part of the first step to creating a universally designed anti-racist classroom is to create safe zones that invite voices and then treasure each voice.
So for somebody just starting out on their UDL journey, what would be the first practical step that they could take to making their classroom anti-racist? So thinking about an individual teacher in an individual learning scenario that wanted to make their classroom anti-racist, what's the first thing that they could practically do?
I think it goes back to where we started at the beginning. Where is racism showing up? It's acknowledging that first racism exists, and then there is a powerful reckoning for practitioners who are white and practitioners of color that there are practices that we could be upholding that are racist. And so we have to have that conversation with ourselves, conversation with others. Where is racism showing up? How do I know? Ask that question, do the reflection, and then the second step is, are you committed to the long haul of action? That is where anti-racism lives. It's not in reflection, it's not in theory, it's not reading a book or attending a workshop, but it is the action. And so listen to where racism is showing up, and you have to listen to your learners, listen to the data, listen to experiences of those who have come before, and then moving, taking action, designing differently, inviting more input from learners, giving multiple means truly. And as you learn more about what learners need, inviting new means that you may not even be an expert on for them to show what they know, for their brilliance to be welcome. Evaluate your outcomes. How are learners of color faring under your leadership in your learning environment? And then start that cycle all over again. It is a long haul, a lifetime commitment, and we have to keep designing until every learner is experiencing those beautiful twins of both success and support for their entire academic career.
If I could just ask a follow-up question on that then, Tesha, I mean, how important is it to keep the lines of communication open with the learners around issues of racism in the classroom environment?
I think it's important to know how you are serving them well and allow them to bring up areas that may seem racist, may be experienced to them in racism. And so I think that building relationship starts first with seeing each learner as a human being. There are areas that they will share with you. There are some learners who will have language to articulate practices that are harmful, and there are some who won't have that language. It is up to us to build anti-racist learning environments that welcome the feedback, that can take the criticism. There's some work that was done. I think the researcher's name is Okun, and he shares that there are some tenets that manifest themselves in cultures of white supremacy. And one of those is this defensiveness, that each time the person in power is criticized or there's feedback that's less than favorable, there goes a power struggle, a defensiveness to protect power as it is. We can be anti-racist when we lay down the defensiveness, take the feedback, hear the struggles with behavior as advocacy for a change in design, see who is failing, who is falling, who is supported, and who could do it with their eyes closed, like not with no support at all. This informs us about our design. And so rather than introducing the conversation as in nature about racism, is actually about our processes that either serve a racist agenda or take the actions of anti-racism to make sure that every learner, including learners of color, are succeeding and supported.
Tesha, I want to thank you for everything that you've said on this podcast today. It's been an absolute pleasure. And for anybody listening, please make sure you take a look at Tesha's book, Antiracism, Universal Design for Learning, Building Expressways to Success. It's a fantastic read. Tesha, once again, I just want to extend my gratitude and heartfelt thanks to you for appearing on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. And if people would like to get in touch, my website is buildingblocksofbrilliance.com.
Fantastic. And anybody that is listening to this, do make sure you check out that website, because it has some fantastic resources on there and obviously some fantastic experiences that have been shared by Tesha. So once again, Tesha, thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin.